Okay, so now everything that we've talked about is for DDR4. This is all DDR4. We haven't talked about DDR5 yet. Now, DDR5 is mostly the same. There is something that I want to mention from way back. So, we need to talk about DDR3. DDR3. This is before Ryzen. So this is going to be AM3 and AM3 Plus. These sockets. We're just going to talk about AM3 Plus. So AM3 Plus consisted of what's largely known or infamously known as the bulldozer. So this is going to be the FX 8150, the FX 8350, etc. So these were the AMD CPUs that predate Ryzen. So these are the DDR3. The reason why I'm bringing this up, the reason I'm mentioning DDR3 is because during the time where AMD did not have Ryzen, they had the FX series, they were post Phenom and the star topology. They were using clustered multi-threading, or CMT, as opposed to simultaneous multi-threading, which is basically what Intel does with hyperthreading. So during this era, they developed their own version of XMP. A lot of people don't know this, but AMD developed AMP, or AMP. AMP. Developed AMP for DDR3 memory profiles. This AMP stands for AMD memory profiles. A lot of people don't know this. Guaranteed there's people in the chat that are like, wait, for real? AMD actually did this? Yes, they had their own XMP long ago, before the era of Ryzen and before the era of competitive CPUs from both AMD and Intel. So, I just want to bring this up because we're about to talk about DDR5. So I want everybody here watching to know that long ago, AMD had their own XMP equivalent on DDR3. Intel had XMP, and AMD had AMD memory profiles. So this is what they had. Now, fast forward to today with DDR5. So here we are with DDR5, AM5. As you guys know, because the original question, now we've come full circle. The original question from Googly, Super Googly, asked, can I, or do I need to buy an EXPO kit, or I guess the original question was like, is there an 8000 megahertz EXPO memory kit? And the answer is no. Today there's only an XMP. So why was the question regarding EXPO? Because there is some understanding that EXPO is an AMD developed protocol, or standard I should say, for the DDR5 memory profile. So EXPO is literally the return of AMP. In fact, when I heard that AMD is coming out with EXPO, I just kind of rolled my eyes thinking, why did they have to rename AMP? Because AMP, in my opinion, AMP sounded cooler than EXPO. Now, you guys can debate on that, whether you think EXPO is better than AMP. I think AMP is easier to remember. AMD memory profile, it's a very easy acronym. I don't know why AMD had to go and reinvent the branding name for their memory profile, but EXPO basically stands for Extended Profiles for Overclocking. This is essentially the exact same thing as AMP from way back in the day. So basically, this is the rebirth of AMP. So what's interesting is when AMD rolled out Ryzen with AM4, they never had a memory standard for themselves. They literally just used Intel XMP all the time. And that's the reason why things like DOCP, which we just talked about earlier, DOCP AXMP, and then Gigabyte and ASRock, they just simply use XMP on AMD. They don't rename it. They don't do anything. That's it. That's why these names came up, because AMD didn't have AMP during like AM4 days. They only got it back with EXPO. Why is 8000 actually ideal for Ryzen? So why is 8000 megahertz DDR5 ideal for Zen 4? I guess that is the question. This is the question of the day. But why is it ideal? Well, let's explain why it's ideal. So I think most people that have watched some of my videos on Zen 4, AM5, aka the Ryzen 7000 series, are aware that when you're talking about memory, you have to be aware of 3 different parameters that surround how the memory performs. One of them is the memory clock, the M clock. Why is everything underlined? Hold on. So there's M clock, which is the memory clock. Then there is U clock, which stands for the Unified Memory Controller clock, or also known as the you can also think of this one as the Integrated Memory Controller, or the IMC. This can also be abbreviated as IMC clock. The third parameter, often neglected or not really talked about, is the F clock, which is the fabric clock. We need to understand, why is this still ideal? Even though you don't get a real world noticeable uplift, it's still ideal for reasons that are largely unknown to the public. And we're going to show this here now. We're going to reveal all the secrets. Now that we've established these 3 parameters, we can now explain why 8000. Like, what's the point of 8000? Well, it turns out that ideally you want M clock, U clock, and F clock to all be equal. This is the ideal, but this is not the reality. This is not the reality. Why is it ideal to have all 3 of them run at the same speed? If they're all synchronized together, it means that any sort of data, or any sort of instruction, I should say, that needs to be completed, whether it's a load, a store, a jump, a JAL, etc. We're talking about assembly code terms here, but I'm just saying, like loading into memory, reading from memory, writing to memory, etc. All these operations that the CPU does when interacting with the memory, if all of these are in sync, then you would think that it all runs very smoothly. Okay? So one thing to keep in mind, the F clock typically runs at 2 gigahertz. This is the typical speed for the fabric clock, and you can't really change this much. You can go a little bit higher. You can add, like 133 megahertz or 166 megahertz or so if you're lucky. But typically, this runs around 2 gigahertz or 2000 megahertz, and you can't really deviate too much from this number. That means that the F clock is almost like a static value that doesn't change. So if we plug in to the equation 2000 megahertz for the F clock, we would ideally want the U clock to also equal 2000 megahertz. And if the M clock, if you want this equation to be the same, then that means the M clock ideally would be 2 gigahertz as well. Now, realistically, this isn't how it would run, right? So you're not going to run your memory clock at 2 gigahertz. Let's use a different example. When you buy RAM at 6000, let's say you get DDR5 or 6000 megahertz on the RAM. That means 6,000 mega transfers per second. So what does that actually mean, though? What is the actual memory clock for 6,000 megahertz RAM? Because the RAM itself is not actually running at 6,000 megahertz on that EXPO or that XMP profile. It's actually running at half that speed. Let's just say 6,000 megahertz rated DDR5 is actually 3 gigahertz RAM speed, memory clock speed. Just so you guys know. If you buy RAM that is rated for 6,000 megahertz, it means that it runs at 3,000 megahertz, not 6,000 megahertz. Okay, so now we can start plugging in some of these numbers. So let's say I have 6,000 megahertz RAM. Let's do for 6,000 megahertz RAM. What is my mem clock, my M clock, when I load my EXPO profile? It's going to be 3,000 megahertz. So now 3,000 megahertz equal. Now here's the part where a lot of people start talking about 1T, 2T. 1T, 2T is technically a different terminology that is typically used with DDR4, but you can use it somewhat loosely when referring to DDR5. It's actually not exactly the same, but your command rate is kind of like your uClock's ability to run at a certain speed. Now, command rate is different from the uClock ratio. So technically, I don't like to use the term 2T and 1T when referring to the uClock speed, because we're talking about command rate versus the actual frequency, which is not exactly the same thing. But what we can say here is that in general, there are two different settings. You can either make the uClock run equal to the mem clock, or you can make it run at half the speed of the mem clock. So if we do uClock equals mem clock, that means we want to do 3,000 megahertz. Now, what happens here is now this is no longer equal. Now, the memory controller, which is the uClock, and the memory itself, which is the DDR5, which is the M clock, they are running in sync with each other, but the fabric is not running in sync with them. Now it is running asynchronously from the other two. It is decoupled from that magic 1:1:1 ratio. We have a mismatch. We have 3 gigahertz and 2 gigahertz sending data across that bus. So think about that. Now we have a mismatch. So what happens here is inside the CPU, the uClock and the fabric clock are mismatched in this scenario where we're running 6,000 megahertz RAM. So what does that mean? That means that it's running asynchronously. And how does the CPU handle an asynchronous configuration like this? Well, what does it have to do? It has to buffer on the side where it's running faster. So on the uClock side, facing to the fabric, it basically has to buffer the data operations in order to keep things running smoothly without errors cropping up. So you have buffering happening inside the CPU to account for the mismatched speed. Okay? So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is something that has to happen because the fabric is running at roughly 2 gigahertz and it can't go above 2 gigahertz. So now this brings us to the 8,000 example. So now let's use the case where we're running 8,000 megahertz RAM. And this is going to answer the question. of why 8,000 is ideal, but it's not really necessary in reality. So the reason why is because when you are running at 8,000, your memory clock is running at 4,000 megahertz. Because remember I said, if you want to know how fast your RAM is actually running, take the rated speed on the profile that you've set and you divide that in half. So 8,000 megahertz RAM means 4 gigahertz DDR5. So that's your mem clock. But now the U clock is in a gear 1 mode, and I haven't explained what gear 1 is, but basically in a 1-to-1 ratio, the UMC, or the Unified Memory Controller, would have to run at 4 gigahertz. Now, realistically, it is not designed to do this. The maximum stable clock that most U clocks can achieve on a Zen 4 CPU is around 3 gigahertz. You can probably go to 3100 or 3200, but that's pretty much going to be the limit in terms of what you can achieve for 24/7 stable operation on Zen 4. It is a limit of the silicon, because remember, we're not talking about the cores, we're talking about what's known as the uncore, the portion of the CPU that is not responsible for very high frequency operation. So the maximum it can do is typically 3 gigahertz, and not much more beyond 3 gigahertz. Likewise, the fabric clock maxes out around 2 gigahertz. So what happens is we run a divider. We run in the M clock equals, or I guess the U clock, I should say, equals half mem clock. So what that means is this will run at 2 gigahertz. But look at this. The fabric clock is still running at 2 gigahertz. So what has this done, or what has this achieved? This has basically removed the buffering that had to happen between the fabric and the memory controller, because these two at 8,000 speed, now the U clock equals the F clock. Now these two are actually synchronized with each other, which means there is no longer any buffering of data on the U clock waiting to go to the fabric to then go to the cores. Because the way that the CPU is designed, you have the cores over here. You've got cores that are running at, up to 5.8 gigahertz on a 7950X, for example, or a 7700X. It's going to be a little bit slower if you're on an X3D CPU in terms of the maximum core clock. But then over here, you have it going to the fabric. So this is the fabric, which is basically F clock. Then over here, you have the memory. So over here, you have the Unified Memory Controller, or the UMC. This is the memory controller. This is your U clock. And then that goes out to memory and back from memory. So think about it like this. Think of the data flow such that the cores go to the fabric goes to the memory controller goes to memory. So out here, I should actually label this, you've got DDR5 out here. You've got this. This portion of the CPU, right here in the middle, this is the I/O die. So on a Ryzen CPU, on an AM5 CPU, if we take the CPU and we look at it, if we were to delid the CPU, what we would see is there's one square here in the middle, or kind of in the middle. And then there are 2 or 1, depending on your CPU. Now, in this example, I'm referring to a 7950X or a 7950X3D because that is what I personally have. That is literally the CPU that I'm using right now, is the CPU that we are detailing here on the screen. So you've got these 2 CCDs, these are your cores. But what I want to illustrate for the audience here is that the F clock and the U clock exist in this I/O die in the middle. And the memory is outside of this. So meaning the wire traces from here to here is much greater in distance than from here to here in the middle. So ideally, if F clock equals U clock, you have no buffering happening in your I/O die. So if both of them are running at 2 gigahertz, in theory, you would expect, better performance because you have no buffering of the data. Everything is flowing smoothly like water. Now, in reality, it doesn't really translate into significant gains. And a lot of that has to deal with the fact that when you're running the DDR at 8000, your latency gets destroyed. Yes, because you're having to run much looser timings on your memory overall. Your cache latency, everything, all the subtimings are far looser than they would be at a lower speed. In general, when you're running at 8000, when you're running your F clock and your U clock synchronized with each other, you don't have any kind of buffering bottleneck between these two happening here. So that's kind of the answer to that. That's the reason why 8000 megahertz on the RAM is actually ideal, but it is so expensive and it doesn't translate into any significant real-world gains, which is why it's largely overlooked.